A cold wind swept through the streets as Daniel Carter walked towards his bookstore, Carter's Haven. The morning was quiet, with only a few people passing by, but something about the air felt different. The city always had a way of making him feel small, but today there was a weight on his chest that he couldn't explain. As he reached the bookstore, he slowed down. Something was wrong. The usual warm glow from the windows was missing. The open sign wasn't hanging on the door. Instead, there was a different sign taped to the glass. Closed for maintenance. Daniel frowned. That didn't make sense. He hadn't ordered any maintenance work. His heart started to beat a little faster as he grabbed the door handle and tried to push it open. It didn't move. He pulled harder, but it was locked. For a moment, he stood there, confused. His own store. His own place. And he was locked out. Then, through the glass, he saw someone standing inside. Ethan Wells. Daniel's store manager stood near the counter, arms crossed, looking straight at him. There was something strange about his expression. It wasn't concern. It wasn't confusion. It was something else. Daniel knocked on the glass. "Ethan, what's going on?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He took a slow step forward, then pushed the door open just enough to speak. "You don't work here anymore, Daniel." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. "What are you talking about?" He let out a short, nervous laugh. "This is my store." Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a folder. He flipped through a few papers, then held one up. "You signed this last year. It gave me control over Carter's Haven." Daniel blinked, trying to understand. He remembered signing some documents, but it was just routine paperwork, nothing serious. "What is this?" he asked, reaching for the paper. Ethan pulled it back before he could touch it. "It's legal proof that you handed over majority ownership to me. You didn't read the fine print, did you?" Daniel felt like the ground had shifted beneath his feet. That couldn't be true. It had to be a mistake. I never agreed to this," he said. His voice was shaking now. "You tricked me." Ethan sighed, shaking his head. "It doesn't matter, Daniel. The papers are real. The store belongs to me now." Daniel's hands curled into fists. "You can't do this." Ethan's face remained calm, but there was something cruel in his eyes. He leaned against the doorframe and crossed his arms. "I already did." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Daniel could hear the sound of passing cars, the distant chatter of people walking down the street. But inside, in his heart, there was nothing but silence. His store, his dream, taken away. "I built this place," Daniel whispered, more to himself than to Ethan. "I started it from nothing." Ethan shrugged. "Yeah, and now it's mine." Daniel felt something inside him break. "Why?" he asked. "I trusted you. I hired you when no one else would. I gave you a chance." Ethan smirked. "And I took it." Daniel stepped forward, but Ethan raised a hand. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." At that moment, 2 security guards appeared inside the store. Daniel recognized them. He had hired them himself. But now, they were looking at him like he was the intruder. Ethan turned slightly towards them. "Make sure he doesn't come back," he said. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. "Ethan, please. This is my life." Ethan's eyes darkened. Not anymore. The security guards moved towards the door. Daniel took a step back. His heart was pounding so hard it hurt. He wanted to fight. He wanted to scream. He wanted to tear those papers apart and make Ethan admit this was a mistake. But he couldn't, because Ethan had won. The door slammed shut. Daniel stood there, staring at the locked entrance of Carter's Haven, his bookstore, his home. And now, it was gone. People walked past him on the sidewalk, unaware of the storm raging inside him. For a long time, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he turned and walked away. But as he stepped into the cold morning air, a thought burned in his mind. This wasn't over. The city felt different. Daniel Carter walked through the streets without a destination. The world around him moved as if nothing had happened. Cars passed by, people laughed, coffee shops filled with customers. But for him, everything felt distant. He had lost everything. His bookstore, his dream, his purpose. Only a day ago, Carter's Haven had been his. A place he built with his own hands. A place where people found comfort in books, where stories lived on the shelves like old friends. Now, it was gone. Taken from him. Ethan had stolen it, using legal tricks Daniel hadn't seen coming. And now, Daniel was locked out of the very place he had created. He reached his small apartment, a tiny one-bedroom space above a grocery store. It had never felt like home before, and now it felt even emptier. He tossed his coat onto the chair, sat on the edge of his bed, and held his head in his hands. What was he supposed to do now? He had no job, no money, no plan. Carter's Haven was everything to him. Without it, he felt lost. The hours passed. The sun went down. He didn't turn on the lights. His phone vibrated on the nightstand. At first, he ignored it, but when it buzzed again, he reached for it with slow fingers. A message. "Meet me. I found something." The sender was Olivia Bennett. She had worked at Carter's Haven for years, helping customers, managing sales, making sure everything ran smoothly. More than that, she had been his friend, someone who believed in him when no one else did. Daniel stared at the message. What had she found? For a moment, he thought about ignoring it. What was the point? Ethan had won. There was nothing left to fight for. But then, deep inside, something small flickered. A tiny spark. He grabbed his coat and walked out the door. The cafe was quiet, with only a few customers scattered around. Olivia sat in the corner, a folder in front of her. She looked up as Daniel approached, her face full of concern. "I was afraid you wouldn't come," she said. Daniel sat down across from her. "I almost didn't." Olivia pushed the folder toward him. "You need to see this." He hesitated before opening it. Inside were pages of financial records, emails, and documents, all with Ethan's name on them. Daniel frowned. "What is this?" Olivia leaned forward. "Proof. Ethan is stealing money from the store." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. "What?" "I started looking into it when he fired me last week," she said. "Something didn't feel right. So I checked the records. He's been overcharging customers, cutting salaries, and transferring money into his own account." Daniel flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the numbers. It was all there. The lies, the theft, the betrayal. Ethan wasn't just a thief, he was a fraud. A fire lit inside Daniel's chest. "He's destroying Carter's Haven," Olivia continued. "Customers are leaving. Employees are quitting. The store is falling apart under him." Daniel clenched his fists. Ethan had stolen everything from him, and now he was tearing it to pieces. He looked up at Olivia. "Why are you helping me?" She met his eyes. "Because this store wasn't just yours, Daniel. It was ours. It meant something to people, and I'm not going to let him ruin it." Daniel felt a lump in his throat. He had been so lost in his pain, so consumed by his own loss, that he hadn't thought about what Carter's Haven meant to others. It wasn't just a bookstore. It was a place where stories were shared, where people found hope, where dreams were born. And it was worth fighting for. He took a deep breath. "What do we do?" Olivia smiled. "We take him down." Daniel looked at the papers again. This was more than just numbers. This was his chance. For the first time since losing his store, he felt something other than pain. He felt a plan forming. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The cold wind brushed against Daniel Carter's face as he stood at the corner of the street, staring at Carter's Haven from a distance. The bookstore that had once been his pride now looked different. The warm glow that used to welcome customers was gone. The window display, once filled with carefully chosen books, looked dull and lifeless. Something inside him twisted. This was no longer the place he had built. Under Ethan's control, Carter's Haven was losing its soul. Daniel took a deep breath. He had spent days going through the documents Olivia had given him. He had read every detail, every stolen dollar, every lie. Ethan had taken more than just a store. He had betrayed the trust of the people who loved it. But now, Daniel had a plan. He walked away from the bookstore, his mind racing. He couldn't just walk in and take it back. The law was on Ethan's side, but there were other ways to fight. He didn't need to use force. He needed to be smart. His first step was simple: let people know the truth. With Olivia's help, Daniel started reaching out to old customers, former employees, and anyone who had ever loved Carter's Haven. They met in coffee shops, small libraries, and even at his tiny apartment. Word spread quickly. People were shocked when they learned what Ethan had done. The idea that the man running the store was stealing from it made them furious. Loyal customers who had supported the bookstore for years felt betrayed. Employees who had been fired or forced to leave shared their own stories of mistreatment. One by one, they started turning away from Carter's Haven. Reviews online took a sharp turn. Where there had once been praise for the cozy atmosphere and friendly service, there were now warnings about high prices, rude management, and a store that had lost its heart. Social media was flooded with posts about what had happened to Daniel, urging people to stop buying from the bookstore until justice was served. Sales dropped. Foot traffic slowed. Inside the store, Ethan started to notice. One afternoon, he stood behind the counter, watching as only a handful of customers wandered through the shelves. It wasn't like before. The place felt empty, cold. A young woman approached the register with a book in her hand. Ethan managed a forced smile. "That'll be $18.99. The woman hesitated. "This book is listed as $12.99 online. Ethan's jaw tightened. "We've had to increase prices due to new policies." The woman frowned. "I think I'll buy it somewhere else." She placed the book back on the shelf and walked out. Ethan exhaled sharply. This was happening more and more. Customers walked in, checked the prices, and left without buying anything. Something was wrong. Later that night, he sat in his office, flipping through sales reports. The numbers weren't good. Profits were falling. Employees were quitting. He had expected some pushback after taking over the store, but not like this. His phone buzzed. A new review had been posted. "Carter's Haven is not the same anymore. Overpriced books, rude staff, and a manager who only cares about money. Bring back the real owner." Ethan clenched his jaw. Daniel. This had to be his doing. The next morning, Daniel stood behind a small wooden table at the park near Carter's Haven. On the table sat a stack of books, some of the best titles that customers used to love from his bookstore. A handwritten sign read, "Stories should be for everyone. Pay what you can." People stopped curious. Daniel greeted them with a smile, handing them books at whatever price they could afford, even if it was nothing. Customers who had walked away from Carter's Haven now lined up at his small stand. They told him how much they missed the store, how they hated what Ethan had done, how they wanted things to go back to the way they were. Daniel listened, nodded, and promised them that he wasn't giving up. Day after day, his book stand grew. More people came. Some brought donations. Others helped set up extra tables. It became more than just a stand. It became a movement. And Ethan noticed. Standing by the window of Carter's Haven, he watched as his customers walked past his bookstore and straight to Daniel's stand. His fingers curled into fists. Daniel wasn't just surviving. He was fighting back. And worst of all, he was winning. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the city streets. Daniel Carter stood at his usual spot in the park, arranging books on the wooden table. The small book stand had grown in the past few weeks. More people came every day, former customers, new readers, and those who had heard about what had happened. The support was overwhelming. People donated books, money, and even their time to help him. It wasn't just about selling books anymore. It was about sending a message. Carter's Haven was falling apart under Ethan's control, and the city knew it. Daniel was handing a book to a young boy when he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. A man stood across the street, watching him. Ethan. His presence was sharp, cutting through the peaceful moment like a blade. Daniel felt his muscles tense. He had expected this. Ethan crossed the street slowly, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. His suit was neatly pressed, but there was something off about him. His usual arrogance had cracks in it. His eyes, once filled with confidence, now carried something else. Anger. Daniel met his gaze but didn't speak first. He wouldn't give Ethan the satisfaction. Ethan stopped a few feet away, his lips pressed into a tight line. He looked around at the crowd, the stacks of books, the customers smiling as they walked away. His expression darkened. "This little operation of yours," Ethan said, his voice low, "needs to stop." Daniel crossed his arms. "Or what?" Ethan let out a small laugh, but it lacked humor. "You're playing a dangerous game, Daniel. You think standing out here with a table full of books is going to change anything. It already has." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You're making me look bad." Daniel let out a breath, shaking his head. "You did that yourself, Ethan. I'm just reminding people who you really are." Ethan took a step closer, lowering his voice. "I own Carter's Haven. That store is mine now. And you're nothing but a man selling books on the street." Daniel didn't flinch. "I'd rather sell books on the street than steal them like you did." The words hit their mark. Ethan's fingers curled into fists at his sides. Daniel continued, his voice steady. "I've seen the numbers, Ethan. Sales are down. Employees are quitting. People are walking past your store and coming here instead. Carter's Haven was built on trust, on community. And you destroyed that." For a moment, Ethan said nothing. The tension between them thickened, pressing against the air like a storm about to break. Then Ethan smirked. "You think you've won." He shook his head slowly. "You don't understand how business works, Daniel. People might feel sorry for you now, but sympathy doesn't last forever. Sooner or later, they'll forget. And when they do, you'll have nothing." Daniel studied him for a long moment. "You're afraid," he said quietly. Ethan's smirk faltered. "You thought you could take everything from me and walk away untouched," Daniel continued. "But you're losing, and you know it." Ethan exhaled sharply, his frustration slipping through his calm mask. "This isn't over," he muttered. Daniel took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "No, it's not." Ethan turned without another word, walking back toward Carter's Haven. Daniel watched him go, his heart steady. Ethan was right about one thing. This wasn't over. But Daniel wasn't giving up. Not now. Not ever. The morning air was crisp as Daniel Carter walked through the city streets. There was a new energy in him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. For weeks, he had been fighting silently, taking small but powerful steps to expose Ethan's corruption. And now, the cracks were showing. Ethan's grip on Carter's Haven was slipping. Sales had dropped sharply, and customers were avoiding the store. Employees who had once feared speaking out were now telling their stories. Reviews online had turned completely against Ethan, calling him out for his greed and dishonesty. Daniel didn't have to force anything. Ethan was destroying himself. But the real blow was yet to come. That morning, Olivia had called him. "You need to see this," she had said, her voice urgent. Daniel had wasted no time. Now he reached a small coffee shop where Olivia was waiting. She sat in the corner, a laptop open in front of her. As he sat down, she turned the screen toward him. "Look at this." On the screen was an email, one that Ethan had sent to a private account. Daniel scanned the words, his heart pounding. Ethan had been taking money from Carter's Haven for months, but this email revealed something worse. He had been lying to investors, exaggerating profits while secretly transferring large sums into his personal account. "This is fraud," Daniel said, his voice low. Olivia nodded. And it's enough to bring him down. Daniel's mind raced. If they exposed this, Ethan wouldn't just lose the store. He could face legal action. He looked at Olivia. "Where did you find this?" She gave a small smile. "Remember how he fired me? He never revoked my access to the system." Daniel let out a breath. Then this is it. It was time. That afternoon, Daniel stood near Carter's Haven, watching as customers walked past without entering. It was a sad sight. The store, once filled with life, now looked empty. Then something changed. A group of people gathered outside. Former customers, employees, even reporters. Daniel had made sure the right people saw the evidence Olivia had found. And now, the truth was spreading. Inside the store, Ethan stood behind the counter, flipping through papers, his face tense. He had seen the emails leak. He knew what was happening. The door burst open. A man in a dark suit entered, followed by two others. Ethan straightened, trying to hide his nervousness. "Can I help you?" he asked, forcing a smile. The man stepped forward. "Ethan Reynolds, we need to talk." Ethan's face paled. Daniel watched through the window as the conversation unfolded. Ethan tried to argue, to deny, but the evidence was too strong. The men, officials from a financial investigation agency, weren't listening to excuses. Then, the moment came. Ethan's hands were pulled behind his back. Handcuffs clicked into place. Gasps filled the store. People outside murmured in shock. Some even cheered. Ethan's face twisted in anger as he was led toward the door. As he stepped outside, his eyes locked onto Daniel. "You did this," he spat. Daniel didn't move. "No," he said calmly. "You did this to yourself." Ethan was dragged away, his time as the owner of Carter's Haven over. A long silence followed. Then, slowly, people turned to Daniel. One voice spoke, then another. "You should take it back. Carter's Haven belongs to you." Daniel took a deep breath. Maybe it was time to rebuild what had been taken from him. And this time, no one could take it away. The sun cast a golden glow over the city as Daniel Carter stood in front of Carter's Haven, staring at the sign above the door. For weeks, he had fought to expose Ethan's fraud. And now, the store was finally back where it belonged. But standing here, looking at the once bustling bookstore, he felt something unexpected. Hesitation. The store wasn't the same. The shelves were still filled with books, but the warmth was missing. The inviting atmosphere that once made Carter's Haven a special place had been replaced by emptiness. Dust had settled on the counters. The air inside felt stale, like a forgotten memory. Daniel exhaled slowly. Taking back the store was one thing. Bringing it back to life was another. He stepped inside, his footsteps echoing in the quiet space. The memories came rushing back. The smell of fresh coffee, the sound of customers chatting, the joy of recommending a book to someone who would fall in love with it. He had to bring that back. But where would he start? A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Olivia standing there, a knowing smile on her face. "Lost in thought?" she asked. Daniel chuckled. "Something like that." She stepped inside, looking around. "It looks different. It doesn't feel like home anymore," Daniel admitted. Olivia folded her arms. "Then let's fix that." Daniel looked at her, a small smile forming. "You still want to help?" She raised an eyebrow. "After everything Ethan put me through?" "Of course." Daniel nodded, feeling a spark of hope. "Then let's rebuild." The next few days were a blur of work. Daniel and Olivia cleaned the store from top to bottom, wiping away the dust, rearranging the shelves, and bringing back the charm that Carter's Haven had lost. They reached out to former employees, inviting them to return. Some were hesitant at first, but when they saw Daniel back where he belonged, they agreed. Word spread quickly. Customers who had once abandoned the store began to return, curious about what was happening. The news of Ethan's downfall had traveled fast, and people wanted to support Daniel. One evening, as Daniel rearranged a display near the entrance, he heard a familiar voice. "Well, well, looks like you're back where you belong." Daniel turned to see Mr. Thompson, one of the bookstore's oldest customers. The elderly man had been visiting Carter's Haven since the day it first opened. Daniel smiled. "I wouldn't be here without everyone's support." Mr. Thompson nodded, looking around. "It's getting there, but you know what's missing." Daniel tilted his head. "What?" The old man smiled. "That little reading corner with the comfy chairs. I used to sit there for hours." Daniel chuckled. "I was just thinking about bringing that back." "Good," Mr. Thompson said, "because I have a feeling people are going to need it." Day by day, Carter's Haven came back to life. The reading corner was restored, complete with soft chairs and warm lighting. The coffee machine was up and running again, filling the air with the comforting aroma of fresh brews. Customers walked in with smiles, excited to see their favorite bookstore returning to its former glory. But Daniel knew there was still one thing missing: a grand reopening. The night before the event, Daniel stood outside the store, looking up at the sign once more. This wasn't just a business. It was a part of him, a place where stories came to life, where people found comfort and inspiration. He wasn't just rebuilding a store. He was rebuilding a dream. The morning sun painted the sky with shades of orange and pink as Daniel Carter unlocked the doors of Carter's Haven. Today was the day. The grand reopening. The moment he had worked so hard for. He stepped inside, taking in the sight of the bookstore he had fought to reclaim. The shelves were neatly stocked, the reading corner was warm and inviting, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee drifted through the air. It was more than just a store. It was a second home, not just for him, but for the people who had always believed in it. As he adjusted a stack of books near the entrance, Olivia walked in, holding a clipboard. She glanced at him with a smirk. "Nervous?" Daniel let out a small laugh. "A little." She nodded. "Good. That means you care." He did care, more than he could put into words. The past few months had been a whirlwind of struggle, loss, and rebuilding. There were moments when he had doubted himself, when he had questioned whether Carter's Haven could ever truly return to what it once was. But now, standing here, he realized something. It wasn't about returning to the past. It was about building something even better. The doors opened at exactly 10 o'clock. At first, only a few people trickled in, curious onlookers, hesitant but hopeful. But within an hour, the store was full. Old customers, new faces, families, students, everyone had come to witness the return of Carter's Haven. Daniel moved through the crowd, greeting people, thanking them, listening to their stories. "Daniel," a familiar voice called out. He turned to see Mr. Thompson, the elderly man who had always been one of the store's most loyal customers. He held up a book with a grin. "You brought back the reading corner," Mr. Thompson said, his eyes gleaming. Daniel smiled. "Of course, it wouldn't be Carter's Haven without it." Mr. Thompson chuckled. "You've done good, son. Real good." Daniel felt a lump in his throat. "Thank you." As the day went on, the energy in the store only grew. People laughed, browsed through books, shared recommendations, and sat in the reading corner, lost in stories. At one point, Daniel took a step back, watching it all unfold. This was why he had fought so hard, not for the business, not for revenge against Ethan, but for this, for the feeling of community, for the love of stories, for the connections that a bookstore like this could create. Olivia appeared beside him, crossing her arms. "So, what do you think?" Daniel exhaled, a deep sense of peace settling in his chest. "I think Carter's Haven is finally home again." She smiled. "Then let's make sure it stays that way." Daniel nodded. This was only the beginning. The legacy of Carter's Haven would live on.